Hey everyone, we are wrapping up chapter 15a, the brain. The next section, chapter 15b, cranial nerves, we'll still be going over parts of the brain, since nerves are sending information to or taking information from the brain. So we're not done with the brain, but we're going to focus on more brain regions, specifically subcortical regions. We just went over brain regions of the cerebral cortex, looking over the different major lobes, different ventricles and meninges as well. We're going to look at some subcortical areas that are generally important for survival, vital functioning things you can't live without. One of those things is, or are, the basal nuclei. You might see this called basal ganglia. That's a misnomer. We'll get to why that's a misnomer later. But the word nucleus in this context, nucleus means an area of cell bodies, neuron cell bodies within the central nervous system. If you recall, centers and nuclei, those are terms for gray matter within the central nervous system that isn't on the outside. Take a look at this picture right here at the bottom. The gray matter towards the outside of the cortex, this is cortex. But basal nuclei are deeper. So these regions, where are you? These regions here. Gray matter that's found deeper within the brain. So these basal nuclei plural because there's more than one nucleus on either side. And they do each have names, but we're not going to go over their names. But these basal nuclei, what they're generally important for, they're important for motor learning, not generating the motor signal. That was the precentral gyrus, the primary motor cortex within the precentral gyrus of the frontal lobe. Not for generating the signal, but for learning and for timing things. They are just inferior and lateral of the ventricles. Lateral ventricles, what I'm coloring here in green, are the lateral ventricles. It also helps with subconscious control of muscle tone. You don't have to think about, having your muscles slightly contracted at all times. One condition that affects your basal nuclei is Parkinson's disease. If you're familiar with Parkinson's disease, it's a condition where a person is unable to control their motions very well. They lose steadiness in their movements, and you often see them shaking. Normally, we shouldn't shake. If we want to hold our hand out, we should be able to hold our hand out still without any issues. If you have issues with your basal nuclei, there's a lack of control. Like a person with Parkinson's can move their arm, for instance, but there's a lack of precision because of damage to the basal nuclei. There's a loss of control, subconscious control of muscle tone. There's a loss of motor learning as well. And so it becomes harder to have fine-tuned movements. Once again, you can see it nicely in this frontal coronal slice of the brain. If you take an interesting horizontal cut of the brain, that's what we see here. There's multiple levels here. There's a horizontal cut here and then a deeper one down here. We can see the basal nuclei. There's one portion right here. There's another right here. And there's another. Actually, that's all we see there. Okay, so we see those two down here. And then these three over here. Those are basal nuclei. And we'll take a look in the cadaver coming up. I mentioned the diencephalon before. The diencephalon, as well as the basal nuclei, are part of the cerebrum. They're just not part of the cerebral cortex. So they're deeper in that big brain mass. So if we're looking in our mid-sagittal cut of the brain, we see our corpus callosum right here. We see our lateral ventricle right here. Look for the rounded portion right here, and then it kind of comes anteriorly, a little bit triangular. This is the diencephalon. diencephalon. Generally, the diencephalon is important for helping you maintain homeostasis and relaying information, sensory information, to higher brain areas. Let me talk about homeostasis first. Homeostasis is something that you'll talk about on and on when you get to physiology, but very generally, what homeostasis is where your body helps you maintain some kind of steady state. For example, you always want your body temperature to be around 37 degrees Celsius. You don't want it to be too low. You don't want it to be too high either. You want it to be just right. It's the Goldilocks rule. To keep it just right, you have to make sure you are producing enough heat. You have to make sure you seek out places where you can stay warm or stay cool, depending on the temperature. And temperature is always changing. Daytime is generally warmer. Nighttime is generally colder. So there's a lot of factors going on and your body has to constantly adjust. That's what homeostasis is, constant adjustments to make sure you're at the right level to keep your body working properly. So that's what homeostasis means. And then relaying sensory information to higher brain areas. This is especially true for the region called the thalamus. The thalamus is this circular region here in the middle. And because it's right in the center here of the brain, say we see something. If our eyes are over here, can you see my drawing here of a circle? That's supposed to be the eye. If that's an eye, you relay information to the thalamus, and then from the thalamus, you relay it to the visual cortex. Or let's say you smell something. Actually, sorry, not smell. Smell is the one exception. Let's say you hear something. So you'd hear something in your temporal lobe. It's hard to draw the temporal lobe because it's off to the side, but you hear something in your temporal lobe. You relay information to the thalamus, and then, oh, sorry, I said that reverse. Let me draw an ear. Okay. So your ear is right here. From your ear, there's an organ where you can hear sound, and then from there you relay information to your temporal lobe. The thalamus is this middle region where sensory information, except smell, goes to and then gets to its final processing place. So once again, the thalamus is that circular one in the center. It's actually sandwiching the third ventricle. The third ventricle is between the left and right halves of the thalamus. We'll get a better look at that when we see it in three-dimensional complete anatomy. The two halves of the thalami, they're not completely separated. There actually is a little connection of brain tissue. That's what this circular region is, and it has a name. This is the interthalamic adhesion. So if you were to look at it from a posterior view, say, you've got a round region of thalamus here, you've got a round region of thalamus here, and then a tiny little bridge connecting the two. That would be the interthalamic adhesion. And then in between it, in this area in between, that would be the third ventricle. The third ventricle is sandwiched, kind of like the cream filling of an Oreo. It's sandwiched between the halves of the thalami. Once again, the thalamus, one major function of it is to relay sensory information. Pretty much all sensory information except for smell, olfaction. There is a region a little bit, let me draw the thalamus again. There's the thalamus. There's a region just posterior, small region posterior to the thalamus. You might see it called epithalamus, epi on top of, to the side of, epithalamus, but the name that we're going to call it is the pineal gland. A gland, if you recall, is a group of cells, tissues that release stuff. The pineal gland is an endocrine organ, and it releases a hormone called melatonin. Melatonin, we'll learn, is a hormone that regulates your circadian rhythms. Circa means approximately, dia means day. Naturally, our bodies have rhythms where we sleep and wake, where we feel hungry at certain times of day, where we have to go to the bathroom at certain times of day. There's tons of other things, but our bodies naturally have a roughly a day rhythm. That's why it's called circadian. Even without sunlight, our bodies would still go on a rhythm. This hormone melatonin released by the pineal gland regulates that sleep-wake cycle, regulates our roughly 24 hours, not exactly 24, that's why it's circadian, regulates this cycle. Thalamus is a relay for senses, septal olfaction. And then we have one more region to discuss, and that is the hypothalamus. Hypo because it's a little bit below. It's kind of shaped like a triangle trapezoid down here. And the hypothalamus, this is a one that's super important for homeostasis. Things like regulating when you're hungry, regulating when you're thirsty, regulating your body temperature, regulating your sexual maturity and fertility, regulating your growth. We're going to learn more and more about the hypothalamus, but those are just a handful of things that it does, and it does more. Super important region of the brain. I want to point out some useful landmarks besides the corpus callosum and the lateral ventricle that you see here. Let me just point out the corpus callosum again. Here's the corpus callosum. Oh, too far. Corpus callosum. This circle here is the anterior commissure. Whoops. You have the lateral ventricle right here. Hanging off of the hypothalamus is an extension called the pituitary. So down here, the true extension of the hypothalamus, I'm going to highlight in red. This is the posterior pituitary. And then there's a somewhat unrelated, because it's not directly connected by neurons, is a gland called the anterior pituitary. Together, you can just refer to them as the pituitary. We're going to learn more about them when we get to the endocrine system. They both produce and release hormones. This pituitary, if you recall, is sitting in an important bone structure. There's a bone structure right here that's covering and protecting it. This is the sella turcica of the sphenoid bone. So that gives you an idea of where this pituitary and therefore hypothalamus is sitting in the brain. It's kind of in the middle. If you cut the top of the head off and look inside, remember that where that sella turcica is? That's where the pituitary is sitting, and so directly above it is the hypothalamus. Directly above that is the thalamus. Pineal gland is just behind that. Pineal gland again is over here. That's the diencephalon. Brainstem literally looks like a stem. hanging off the brain. The way I compared it is like if you're holding a thing of cotton candy, you're holding the handle, and then you got cotton candy all around. The thing all around is the cerebrum. What you're holding is the stem, the brainstem. Brainstem is super important for basic survival functions. It's the most caudal part of your brain, the tail end of your brain. And it can be roughly divided into 3 parts. There's actually a couple more, but we're going to simplify. 3 parts. The midbrain, that's what I'm tracing in green. That's the midbrain. And if you look at this reference picture, it's over here. It's hiding because the cerebrum is so big. The midbrain is just caudal to the thalamus. Remember, our thalamus is that big round thing right here, and then the hypothalamus is coming off of that. To recognize the next part of the brainstem, the pons. The pons on the anterior ventral side has a big bulge. You can see on the anterior, whoops, too far down. On the anterior side has a big bulge. And it's also at the level of the cerebellum. The cerebellum is right there where I drew there. But this is the pons. The last part of the brain, the most caudal part of the brain, is the medulla oblongata. It's elongated, and medulla means core. So if we're using that cotton candy analogy, the stem is your core, it's the center. Not exactly the center, I would call the thalamus the center, but here we are. Medulla oblongata. Midbrain, pons, medulla oblongata. When I say most basic vital things for survival, I mean things like regulating breathing, regulating blood pressure, regulating heart rate. Really, really vital things for living. The cerebellum, that funny looking little brain, that's what cerebellum means, that funny looking little brain on the back posterior side. Cerebellum is important for balance, coordination, precision, and accurate timing. I know that sounds a lot like the basal ganglia, basal nuclei, and they do talk to each other, but think of the cerebellum as like, if you need to walk in a straight line and pass that sobriety test, you need a perfectly functioning cerebellum. If you want to know how to catch a ball that's being thrown at you, a lot of things are important there, but you need the cerebellum. It's great for timing and coordination. Let me go backward a little bit. You can see the cerebellum right here. This is a lateral view. Next slide. This is that same lateral view, but we've cut a bit of the cerebellum open so that you can see inside of it. Whoops. Cut a little bit of the cerebellum so that you can see inside of it. When you cut it open and look inside, you'll notice that the edges have wrinkles, just like the cerebrum, and there's gray matter towards the outside. That gray matter is the cerebellar cortex, not the cerebral cortex. Cerebral cortex is up here. Cerebellar cortex is the gray matter, where you find the neuron cell bodies of the cerebellum. The white matter that branches and looks kind of like a tree, we call that the arbor vitae. Arbor vitae. Arbor vitae literally means tree of life. It looks like a tree. I don't know where the tree of life comes from, but that's what it's called. Arbor vitae, those are the white matter axon tracts sending messages from the cerebellar cortex. So cerebellar cortex has the gray matter, neuron cell bodies. Arbor vitae's white matter has axons. If you look at a posterior view So take a look at this reference. Posterior view of the cerebellum. You can see that the cerebellum is divided into two halves, but there's actually a midline lobe. This midline lobe right here kind of looks like a worm, like an earthworm. To say worm is vermis. The vermis is this worm-like midline lobe. So you got a left hemisphere, a right hemisphere, and this midline lobe, the vermis. The cells of the cerebellum are not, they're not pyramidal cells. In the cerebrum, we have pyramidal cells. In the cerebral cortex, we have pyramidal cells. In the cerebellum, you have cells called Purkinje cells. Purkinje, it's a Polish name, it's a Polish scientist. They're also multipolar neurons. It's an interneuron because you're receiving tons of information. In order to balance and have coordination, you use your vision, use hearing, use touch, use all kinds of senses to know and get feedback about your body's position. So you're getting all this information and sending it to your cerebellum so that you can coordinate yourself. Additionally, because of that, because it's a multipolar interneuron receiving tons of information, the branches of dendrites are huge. In this special labeling, you can see everything that I just circled there is the dendrite. All of that is dendrites. The cell body is over here. And the axon is also not very big. Axon would be going that way. And the axon would extend somewhere else in the brain to relay information to help coordinate your movement. We don't have this type of labeling, these type of slide in our lab. We have histology that's closer to looking like this. And the Purkinje cells that you see here, the Purkinje neurons, are these ones. You can see the cell body. And then you can see a little bit of the branching dendrites coming out here. You're just not seeing the really nice labeling that we see in that bottom left special fluorescence photo. But you can see several neurons here, 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 here. And these dendrites branch out this way. So that wraps up chapter 15a. We've talked about the different things that protect the brain, like meninges and cerebrospinal fluid of the ventricles and central canal for the spinal cord. Talked about the cerebral cortex and how there's many different specializations for really higher order thinking, cognitive abilities. We've talked about white matter tracts, how they send information to and from the brain, or even between hemispheres or within the same hemisphere. And we've seen how how the brain has structure-function relationships at both gross anatomy level and cellular level, histology level, tissue level. We can see pyramidal neurons in the cerebral cortex and Purkinje neurons in the cerebellar cortex. And like I've said, we've compared the difference in function between the cerebral cortex and then the subcortical regions. Subcortical is more basic, fundamental survival stuff. Cerebral cortex is more cognitive. Let's switch over to some videos in complete anatomy to make some comparisons. Looking first here at complete anatomy. This is from the videos page of brain and cranial nerves. It's the basal ganglia, diencephalon, limbic system, brainstem. I should change the basal nuclei link. We can see in this mid-sagittal cut, and a bit faded in some areas, we can see things like the lateral ventricle. I've only highlighted a piece of it here. If we look from this lateral anterior view, this region right here, it's called the putamen. This is part of the basal nuclei. This caudate nucleus is also part of the basal nuclei. So let me label that. Oops. This part here, and this part here are part of basal nuclei. Right next to just inferior lateral of the lateral ventricle. Basal nuclei look a little, they look interesting. They have an interesting shape here. So some parts are round, some parts are curved. I'm going to clear this. Let me rotate the view. You can see from this angle, compared to the thalamus. Whoops. The thalamus is, this is a posterior view right now. This is half of the thalamus. And then again, you can see these parts of the basal nuclei. Let's compare that to a cadaver brain. So I'm going to switch over. This one. In this video from UBC Neuroanatomy, we see a frontal cut of the brain. Let's point out some basic landmarks, things that we can use to figure out where we are. Got a lateral ventricle here. I want you to remember the lateral ventricle is big and it curves. So what I've pointed out is a lateral ventricle and also on the other side. But check this out. This is also lateral ventricle. Because it's a long curved structure, we can see it in 2 different places, well, 4 different places. We've got our septum pellucidum, that thin thing separating the halves of the different sides of the lateral ventricle. We can see our corpus callosum, the white matter that crosses hemispheres. We can see the third ventricle. You see this little line and also this hole right here. So sandwiching the third ventricle, this gray matter, which I'm circling, this gray matter is the thalamus. We see more gray matter on either side of the thalamus, more lateral. This is part of the basal nuclei. These are part of the basal nuclei. While we're here, I want to point out a few more brain regions that I didn't have in the slides yet. They will be explained more in chapter 15b because they're directly related to the cranial nerves, but they're visible here in this view and in another view that I'll show. If you look inferior, you see this kind of curved region. It's gray matter. This is called the hippocampus. It's a funny name. In Greek, it means seahorse. Kind of see a seahorse shape here, but it's when you look at the full picture of it, it looks even more like a seahorse. So let's look actually at a different view. This is a frontal coronal cut of the brain. And you can, let me point out one more thing. You see that the hippocampus is directly outside of this portion of the lateral ventricle. The hippocampus is in this medial temporal lobe. In this dissection, it's a mid-sagittal cut of the brain. I want to point out the cerebellum is missing, the brainstem is missing, and we've even removed part of the temporal lobe. So special sections have been cut out of the brain so we can better see something. The thalamus is right here. And here is the interthalamic adhesion. Over here, thanks to this special dissection, we can see this very, very curved structure. That's the hippocampus. And watch as this person moves it a little bit. What they're tracing right now, hippocampus is gray matter. What they're tracing right now is a white matter tract that starts in the hippocampus, which is a bit lateral. This tract then comes more medial, comes around and down. This is called the fornix. The fornix is the white matter tract of the hippocampus. I didn't explain what the hippocampus does. The hippocampus very generally is important for learning and memory. If you've watched 50 First Dates and you see Drew Barrymore's character bump her head and she forgets things, she has damage to her hippocampus. It's that in some cases, there are people who, not such a cute way, but some people have this memory condition where they have damage to their hippocampus and can't remember things. The fornix is what sends information out from the hippocampus, and it curves up and around the thalamus. There's a region just outside of the corpus callosum, which I'm going to highlight in orange. This rough region outside of the corpus callosum, this is the cingulate gyrus. Cingulate gyrus. Let me change that to, whoops. The cingulate gyrus is a region that's important for generally important for emotions. So we have the cingulate gyrus, we have the hippocampus, the fornix delivers information. You can't see it from this view, but I will point out a region called the mammillary bodies that's sitting on the ventral underside of the brain. And I will point out another region that is not visible here because it's been removed, but this rounded region just at the tail end of the hippocampus called the amygdala. Together, cingulate gyrus, let me erase the thalamus. These regions together make up something called the limbic system. very generally, the limbic system is important for learning, for memory, and emotion. The limbic system is important for learning, memory, and emotion. We have the cingulate gyrus, the hippocampus, the fornix. The fornix leads to the mammillary bodies, and then another organ or region of the brain separate is the amygdala. This will be more apparent if we take a look at complete anatomy. Here's a lateral view. Whoops. Here's a lateral view. You can see the amygdala right here. There's the amygdala. They call it amygdaloid body. It's the same thing. Amygdala means almond. It's almond shaped. The hippocampus is this curved structure that comes up and around. And then the fornix is that extension of the hippocampus that continues because it's white matter. Comes up and around the thalamus. If I rotate and look underneath a little bit, so sorry, I'm messing up the drawing a tiny bit, but take a look over here. Whoops. Try it one more time. Do you see these rounded things? There's one here and one here on the underside of the brain. These are called mammillary bodies because they look like two breasts. Mammillary bodies. That's what the fornix leads to. And then remember that the cingulate gyrus is just the region it's just the region, sorry, here we go. Just the region outside of the corpus callosum. So all of this together makes up the limbic system. Important for memory, learning, and emotion. Let me give you a clearer view of the mammillary bodies. Here we're looking at the inferior view of the brain. We're going to learn that this cross right here is where axons come for vision. This cross is called the optic chiasm. It'll be a useful landmark. And then you can see those two rounded mammillary bodies. Some more important landmarks that can be useful. Remember on this ventral anterior side of the brainstem, this big round thing, that's the pons. The midbrain is hiding above it, rostral to this. And then see this hole? It's not always a hole. There should be an attachment called the infundibulum. The infundibulum is a stalk that connects to the pituitary. So missing from this is the pituitary. And then connected to that superior to what we're looking at would be the hypothalamus. So the optic chiasm, infundibulum / pituitary, mammillary bodies, that's a really useful landmark to find things within the brain. Let's switch to a mid-sagittal view of the brain. In this mid-sagittal view of the brain, you can find the corpus callosum here. The thalamus right here. We have hypothalamus. We have the pineal gland. I was pointing out landmarks that are useful, like the optic chiasm. And this rounded part, that's one of the mammillary bodies. Not shown here because the pituitary has been removed is the pituitary and its infundibulum. The reason why it's usually not on a cadaver brain that we pull out is because since the pituitary is protected by bone, when you pull the brain out, the bone just yanks it off. So the pituitary should be in between. Whoops. In between the optic chiasm and the mammillary body, we will be able to find an infundibulum. This is not to scale, but infundibulum is the stalk that's holding the pituitary, and then the pituitary itself is this rounded part. There is an anterior and posterior pituitary. We'll go into the details later. And there it is. There's more we can see here relating to the brainstem. So let me clear this and show other structures. Once again, a useful landmark is the thalamus. So I'm going to circle that again. This is a mid-sagittal view. I like to identify the pons first if we're looking at the brainstem, because the pons has this nice big bulge on the anterior side, the ventral side. There's the pons. In between the pons and the thalamus, that's where you can find the midbrain. The midbrain, let me draw that again. Didn't show up. The midbrain has two bumps on the back, on the dorsal side. There's one bump here and one bump here. The first bump is called the superior colliculus. The word colliculus means hill. Looks like a little hill. And it's the top one, hence superior. And then this other bump is the inferior colliculus. These are help process sensory reflexes. We'll get to that in the cranial nerves chapter, but the next part. Superior colliculus and inferior colliculus are sitting, they are part of the midbrain. They're on the back side, the dorsal side of the midbrain. Another useful landmark, remember this little canal for cerebrospinal fluid? That's the cerebral aqueduct. The cerebral aqueduct is at the level of the midbrain. And then we have the medulla oblongata just caudal to the pons. With the cerebellum, you can see the whole thing here. If you look closely, you can see the gray matter towards the outside and how we've maximized surface area here. The gray matter, that's the cerebellar cortex. And then the white matter branches a lot like a tree. That's just some of it. That's known as the arbor vitae, arbor vitae. So this is all visible from a mid-sagittal view. I do want to show a couple more views of the brainstem. There's some more interesting landmarks that we can point out that we'll have to see from different angles. Here's that inferior view again of the brain. The big rounded bulge is the pons. And then the medulla leading to the spinal cord is here. If you look closely, the medulla has some important structures. There's this midline raised bump that goes all the way down. So there's one on one side, and then there's another on the other side. These are called the medullary pyramids. Medullary pyramids. These pyramids are made of white matter. These are axons. So they are relaying information up and down to and from the brain, ascending tracts and descending tracts. We'll also learn about a special thing that happens here called decussation. There's a point where axons cross over for contralateral innervation. Remember that word, contralateral? We get a crossing over of axons from one side to the other. On either side, you can see a bulge here and here. These are known as medullary olives. Medullary olives are gray matter. You can find neuron cell bodies here. So pyramids are white matter, olives are gray matter. And those are going to be important for processing sensory things and other things that we'll get to in chapter 15b. This is an anterior dorsal view of the brain, inferior dorsal view of the brain, and ventral side of the brainstem. We'll call this ventral because the angle of the brain makes it weird. So this is the anterior ventral side of the brainstem. If we remove the brainstem, isolate it, again, you can see the pons. You can see a pyramid. You can see an olive. You can see where the infundibulum would be. You can see the chiasm, that crossing. You can see a mammillary body, both of them actually. This is the brainstem isolated. This view is the dorsal posterior side of the brainstem. So we've removed the cerebellum. The cerebellum would be right here. And of course, most of the cerebrum is gone. On the back side of the midbrain, you can see two bumps right here. That's the backside, dorsal side of the midbrain. Those are the superior colliculi. Colliculi is plural of colliculus. And then inferior to that, we've got the inferior colliculi. Together, the superior and inferior colliculi, you can refer to all four of them as the corpora quadrigemina. That literally means quadruplets, quadruplet bodies. Corpora means bodies, quad means four, quadruplets, quadruplet bodies of the midbrain. All right, we've gone through a lot of important brain structures. We're going to revisit these when we talk about how they're related to pathways relating to cranial nerves and also spinal nerves later on in chapter 16. So thank you for watching. Please let me know if you have any questions, if you'd like me to clarify anything, if you'd like to see a different view. A lot of resources out there and I can point you to the right one. Thanks everyone. I'll see you in the next video.